So my name is Tom Bowman, and I am Director of Innovation at Berry Street, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to join us here tonight. Berry Street acknowledges the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as traditional custodians of the lands, skies and waterways across Australia. We pay our respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander elders past and present. Berry Street is proud to join the National Thrive by 5 campaign, and at Berry Street we believe that children, young people and their families should be safe, thriving and hopeful. It defines our purpose and reflects our 140-year plus history and guides our future. Quality, affordable, accessible early childhood education is key to addressing disadvantage and helping children and families to achieve success. Children's experiences of abuse or neglect and their background of trauma can be incredibly detrimental to their development and learning. They may often display complex behaviours that are difficult for caregivers to manage. Berry Street is an international expert in the research and implementation of trauma-informed practice. Our Take 2 service provides specialised therapeutic support to children, young people and families who have experienced trauma. Our Berry Street education model, which has been adopted in schools and kindergartens across the country, with over 1,000 more schools coming on board in 2020 alone, is a trauma-informed education model. We are now rolling out this model to early childhood centres, and tonight you'll hear from a panel of these expert practitioners about development and managing complex behaviours in early childhood. Before the panel, I'm pleased to be able to introduce Georgie Dent. Georgie is a journalist, editor, author, MC, facilitator and prominent advocate for women's empowerment, gender equality and mental health. She is the Executive Director of The Parenthood, a not-for-profit parent advocacy group that is a key partner of the Thrive by 5 campaign. She is also a contributing editor at Women's Agenda. And I am going to hand over, lastly, her best-selling memoir, Breaking Badly, was published by Affirm Press in May 2019 to critical acclaim. And so I'd like to thank Georgie for joining us tonight, and I'm going to hand over to Georgie to take it from here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tom, for that lovely introduction. My name is Georgie Dent, and I am, as Tom said, the Executive Director of the Parenthood. I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are all meeting. And for me, I am in my home in Sydney, and the traditional owners are the Camaragal people of the Eora Nation. And I would like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. It is, it's terrific to have this opportunity to speak to you. I am I'm filled with admiration for the work that Berry Street does. Our mission at the Parenthood is to make Australia the best place in the world to be a parent, because we believe that when parents are supported, children can thrive and our whole community and communities will be stronger. And so obviously there's a very firm and clear alignment between our sort of objectives and the work of Berry Street. As Tom mentioned, the Parenthood is also a partner on the Thrive by 5 campaign, which is a really terrific national campaign to sort of make Australia have a very serious conversation about the need for universal access to high quality early learning and childcare for all children, regardless of what your parents do, what they don't do, where you live. The aim that we should all have is for every child to have access to the high quality early learning that we know will set them up for a future of success. I thought, and also a future filled with hope. I loved that last part when you said that, Tom. I thought I'd give you a little bit of a sort of outline of kind of how I came to be in the role that I have at the Parenthood, and how I've come to sort of be quite active in this particular campaign. So I have got 3 children. Our eldest daughter is nearly 11, which seems strange because she was only born about 30 seconds ago. So I don't know how that has worked out, but the calendar says in a few weeks she'll be 11. We've also got an 8-year-old and a 5-year-old. And my husband and I, when we had our first child, we actually had her overseas. but came back to Sydney, and I was lucky enough to go back to my job. I was a business journalist, and I was working at BRW magazine, and they had offered me my old job back 4 days a week, which I thought was terrific. And so we sort of set about finding, my husband and I live in Sydney, neither of our families live in Sydney. We were quite young, we didn't have friends that had children yet. We both were quite naive about the fact that if you had a particular child and you lived in a particular area, it would just be as simple as saying, here's my child, can we enroll her, on these particular days? But obviously we were very mistaken. So I think I sent off about 45 emails before we came back to Sydney, and I got lots of responses basically saying, there's no chance of you finding 4 days a week, in any service around here. And I was trying. That was even before I sort of had much appreciation or awareness of the different particular types of services, of the quality ratings. But we eventually, about 2 weeks before I was due to start work, we were offered a spot in the centre of Sydney CBD. Now, this would have been particularly convenient if either myself or my husband worked in the CBD of Sydney. But we didn't. We both worked about 20 minutes outside of the CBD, but because that was the only service that we found that had a spot for our daughter, that was what we did. We took her in on the bus every morning and every afternoon before going off to our own places of work. And this was 10 years ago, and it was $165 a day, and it was 4 days a week. And suddenly I was really, as a journalist at BRW magazine, I had been very interested in the picture around women. And I was sort of, I was naive enough to go through school and university thinking that the women before me had sorted gender equality, and that I would, arrive in the workplace and that would all be done. And when I arrived in the workplace, it was very clear to me that the work was not done. And as a journalist at BRW magazine, I really became quite passionate about and focused on that subject. And I started a blog around the same time, and I was writing a lot about this sort of issues for women. And naturally, our personal experience of trying to access care was really illuminating to me in a really practical sense of why, for a lot of families, it is really difficult for two parents to maintain attachment to the workforce. And I said that from a position where we were very, very privileged. We were both well educated. At that point, 10 years ago, our childcare fees were more than we were paying on rent. But we were both sort of willing to make that call because we were hopeful that our careers would put us in a position where longer term that would be okay. But it was so difficult in a logistical sense. And so I guess that was sort of my awakening to some of the issues that we had in Australia around early childhood education and care. And I know now, 10 years on, I've got a much deeper appreciation of some of the issues that we have that affect families. But really, that I think that personal experience put me on a trajectory, I suppose, that meant that about 12 months ago, when the Parenthood was approached about joining the Thrive by 5 campaign, it felt to me like this was absolutely the job that I had to take, because in the 10 years, I hadn't written every single day only about early education and care, but I had written a lot about paid parental leave and about sexual harassment and about family and sexual violence. And, this having an opportunity to take on a more formal advocacy role to really champion the need for change and also to really represent the voices of parents in that conversation was something that I was really excited about. And we have been, I think probably what I have come to appreciate, which I'm sure a lot of people on this call will understand, is that the one of the challenges that we have when we're talking about reform in this area is that there are so many really valid, compelling reasons why making the sort of investment that we're talking about to create universal access to high quality early learning and care makes sense. We know, and I know this particularly because of my background writing about issues impacting women, that it is a critical issue to get right, to give women the ability to participate in the workforce. And we have to be realistic about the fact that when we talk about women's safety, women's economic security is inextricably tied up with that concept. It is impossible for women to be safe if they don't have financial security. And we know that in Australia, families pay the fourth most expensive out-of-pocket fees for early childhood education and care in the OECD countries. We know that Australia has got a really strange situation where we rank number one in the world for educating females, for female attainment, but we rank 70th in the world for female workforce participation. And that is an unusual gap, because in the World Economic Forum's Global Gender Gap Index that they publish each year, they track equality between men and women on 4 measures. And one of them is health, one of them is educational attainment, one of them is workforce participation, and one of them is political representation. And generally speaking, the trend is that the better attainment rate for females, the higher workforce participation rate, because generally if you're educating and skilling women, then they will be able to participate in the workforce. In Australia, obviously, we have got this really significant gap between the way we educate women and then the extent to which women can participate in the paid workforce. And the lack of, or the high cost, the high out-of-pocket cost is one of the explanations for that. And it's not sort of just a theory. There's so much research that backs up the fact that when countries make early education and care more affordable, women's workforce participation increases significantly. We also have got a really unusual tax system that punishes a lot of women, in effect, because we calculate the particular subsidy or overall benefit that a family is entitled to on the basis of a primary and secondary earner. And it's one of these catch-22s where, because we don't have infrastructure like high quality early education, which means women are on an even playing field, women are working less, they are earning less. And so women are often the secondary earner, which means we have a situation where for lots of women to work beyond 3 days a week, they would effectively be paying to go to work. And so they don't, they choose not to work. And it's easy, I think, to kind of listen to these facts and figures and construe it as being an issue around, successful or only high income earning women. But what we know is that getting the early education infrastructure right, so that we don't just sort of permit some women to go to work, but we enable it and actively encourage it, that gives a whole generation of women, a whole cohort of women, the opportunity to become even low income earners as opposed to no income earners, or to go from being a low income earner to being a middle income earner. The way we have it at the moment is women aren't having those opportunities. And so, we do have a situation where women's financial security is incredibly precarious. So, women aged over 55 have been the fastest growing group of Australians experiencing homelessness for over 5 years now. And the reason for that is because, the way that anyone accumulates retirement savings is by working. And because we haven't got the infrastructure right, women do take up the majority of the unpaid care work. It means they don't have as consistent attachment to regular paid work. They're missing out on the opportunities there for pay rises, for promotions. And then they reach 55 and Elizabeth Broderick was the one who said that, so often the price that we are asking women to pay for a lifetime spent caring is poverty. Poverty is really, I suppose, the aspect where it's one of the aspects where we need to talk about how children are affected by these issues, because we know that for all children, experiencing high quality early education in those formative years is absolutely critical. We know that children who attend high quality early learning are far less likely to arrive at school developmentally vulnerable. We know that at the moment, 1 in 5 children arrive at school developmentally vulnerable. And we know also that in Australia, 3 and 4-year-olds don't participate in early education in the same numbers that they do in other OECD countries. And we know that most often, the children who aren't attending early education care are the cohort of children who would benefit the most. And they are children with any disadvantage. We know that I mean, I don't like to talk about children in that context of return on investment, but we know that money that is spent in those early years is the best investment we can make in giving children, but particularly children with any disadvantage, an opportunity to arrive at school and be ready to learn, and to leave school and be employable and willing and able to participate in society and have hope. So that's the sort of children tack, and as well as the women tack. But of course, they meet right in the middle, because we know that mothers do maintain the larger caring role. We know that women, predominantly single parent households, are headed by women. We know that single mothers are a group more likely to be living in poverty than others. We know that children experiencing poverty, there is even further disadvantage that comes with that. So we need to be looking at at that bigger picture and thinking it's not just about women themselves deserving the agency or dignity that comes from earning an income, but it's also about setting up households and families so that when children are in an environment, their parents are able to support them. And I guess this is what one of the benefits that we have about the Thrive by 5 campaign is that there are organisations involved that come at this issue from slightly different angles, but ultimately we're coming to the same goal. Now, I can't pick, well, actually, I suppose I can pick. For me, if I was going to pick one reason to invest in high quality early education, it would be for the benefit that it would give to children, because that is an investment in our future that gives us a sort of richer opportunity for establishing prosperity and establishing connections and community from which we can all thrive. But I guess with my hat on as the Parenthood Executive Director, I'm really interested in not just having a conversation about the importance of early education being high quality and accessible and completely affordable, but also about the other policies that we know make a difference in the lives of parents. So earlier this year, late last year, we commissioned Equity Economics to undertake a piece of economic modelling and research that we published in February. And we asked them to examine the question, what would the social and economic benefits be of making Australia the best place in the world to be a parent? And what they did was basically evaluate what are the key policies and practices that make a positive impact in the lives of families, and particularly in the lives of children. And unsurprisingly, what the research showed was that getting the support right for parents is absolutely fundamental to getting things right for children. It will come as no surprise, I don't think, to anyone on this call of how closely linked those things are. You would struggle, I think, to find someone who would say they don't think every child deserves the best start to life. But where there seems to be a gap is when you say, well, if you want every child to have the best start in life, that involves not just looking at that individual child, but it involves looking at the supports and structures around them. How likely is it that their parents are able to access the support they need? And what our research showed was that really having appropriate high quality health support for parents in the perinatal and postnatal periods, as well as birth and infancy, is absolutely critical to family wellbeing and child wellbeing. The research shows that having at least a year of paid parental leave that is available and encouraged to be shared between two parents is the best, that generates the best case results for families and children, because you're giving families the opportunity to adjust in that critical period, financially, socially, logistically. It also finds that having access to high quality universal early education and care is the gold standard. If we're looking at how we support parents and children, that is fundamental. And the other thing that is critical is workplaces that value not just parenting, but caring. And my view is that if we can get the structural changes around paid parental leave being more generous, Australia's got the second least adequate paid parental leave scheme in the OECD. So we offer, the government scheme is 18 weeks at the minimum wage. In the OECD, the average is 50 weeks of paid leave. And it actually has been that for about 10 years. And, you know, Australia, we got our first government provided paid parental leave scheme just over 10 years ago. And it was introduced as a really basic, I mean, it was a terrific achievement to get it through, but it was introduced as this is the bare minimum. We're going to do 18 weeks at the minimum wage with the idea that we will have employers offer additional leave, that we will have, that it would be increased over time. It hasn't been touched. We have less than half of the biggest employers in Australia offer any paid parental leave. So it means that for the vast majority of parents in Australia, the most that you will get is 18 weeks at the minimum wage, which puts incredible pressure on the family unit and on the parents at a really pivotal time. And this is even before you take into account what we are going to discuss tonight, which is what about when there are additional layers of complexity there, when there's trauma involved. And we know that it's not good enough even for families that aren't experiencing that. And so it's diabolical for families that are also juggling the additional layer of additional needs or trauma or any of the other things that we know can make family life so much more difficult. My sense is very much that if we could make the structural changes to paid parental leave that really normalised and encouraged the support of parents and parenting, and we could get the systemic change for universal access to high quality early education and care, I think those two things would lead to, by necessity, more workplaces and more community expectation and understanding of what it is to be a parent and to be caring and to know that those things can coexist. So that is, I think I'm just 1 minute from my time, and actually right on cue, come here. I just had a little friend who's meant to be in bed, but she's joined me here. But yeah, that is really what I would sort of say is my take on why I'm passionate about running the parenthood and about supporting Thrive by 5. And I have been really so heartened by the sort of momentum that we have managed to gather with the campaign in a relatively short space of time. I think there are lots of people who are really on board with the need for us to sort of push for these big picture changes, because systemic problems require systemic solutions, and tinkering around the edges of these sorts of problems is not going to be sufficient. And that is what we've been doing for too long. I'm just going to pass Ruby over now. But thank you.
Thank you, Georgie. And I think you said it was Ruby for making a star guest appearance there at the end. I think you're going to stay around post the panel. So if people have got questions, hold on to them or put them in the chat and we'll get to those afterwards. There was a few things there that kind of made me really reflect, this challenge of the high cost, but then the critical importance of access, and feels like a real call to arms to get that system change so that all children can access that high quality early childhood education. It made me think I want to go and live in Scandinavia with some of my old university friends where those things are much more to the fore. But anyway, we'll hold on to those questions. If you've got questions, like I say, put them in the chat. I'm going to introduce now our panel, and then our panel and Georgie will be here for questions. Managing these things on a screen is a bit tricky, particularly when someone else changes my screen and I can no longer see my notes. But I know you were trying to help me there behind the scenes, folks. So I want to introduce our panel of Bury Street staff who work in services delivering a trauma response. These three are world-renowned experts, and I'm not just saying that because they're my colleagues, and researchers in trauma-informed practice. So Dr. Alison Cox has more than 25 years experience in child and adolescent mental health services, providing psychodynamic oriented therapy and developmentally focused specialist consultation. Alison is director of the statewide Take Two service at Berry Street. Alison might wave, there she is. Dr. Tom Brunzell has experience as a teacher, school leader, researcher and education advisor. Currently, he is the Director of Education at Berry Street and Honorary Fellow at the University of Melbourne Graduate School of Education. Tom presents internationally on topics of transforming school culture, student engagement, trauma-aware practice, well-being and positive psychology, as well as effective school leadership. His new book, Creating Trauma-Informed Strength-Based Classrooms, is going to be released in June this year. And last but not least, Joanne, and Tom perhaps would wave if you didn't, Tom, sorry, I was trying to read and look at the same time. And Joanne Alford is currently the principal of the Berry Street School, a school for young people who have considerable gaps in their education from either trauma, disrupted attachment, social disadvantage, or disengagement from the mainstream school system. And Joanne has enjoyed a varied and creative career pathway before taking on the role of principal of the Berry Street School, and a highlight of this was teaching for 3 years in the remote Aboriginal community in the stunning Western Australian Kimberley region. And as I'm shivering here in Melbourne, that sounds quite attractive. So that's our panel. We've got some questions starting to come into the chat, but I've got a couple of prompter questions just whilst people warm up. So I'm going to direct this first question to you, Tom. How do we help children who don't have strong language skills yet to express their emotions? And the other panel members may, and Georgie may also want to jump in on that, but firstly to you, Tom.
Thanks, Tom, and thanks, Georgie, for your message earlier. I'd like to just start by saying we're always teaching literacy, and that's my bias as a teacher-like person. We're always teaching literacy, and in the early years, we're modeling it. And I'd like to think of children as little imitation machines, and they are sensing and mirroring our cues verbally and non-verbally every time they're in our presence. So when a little one requires our support and they may not have the words for it yet, I want to encourage adults to purposely use your emotional vocabulary and provide emotional labels like, you look confused, or maybe that's a little curious, or maybe both. Sometimes part of us is confused, part of us is curious. And finally, we want to bring it back to the body and helping children notice their own bodies and changes in their bodies to build a communication with trusted adults when they feel like their bodies might be sending them some messages.
Thanks, Tom. Alison, Joanne, Georgie, anything else you want to add to that?
Thanks, Tom and Georgie. Just to add maybe a little another perspective slightly from what Tom's already talked about, which is fabulous as well, is that there's lots of non-verbal ways that we communicate all of the time. And sometimes while children are developing verbal language, we can use pictures and diagrams or even signing as a mechanism to help children develop other means of communication while we're maybe waiting for their verbal language to develop, or to augment it. And that's another valuable strategy that we can use.
Thanks, Alison. I'm looking in the chat. People still feel free to add any questions you may have. I've got a few others, so don't panic. I've got a question for Joanne and maybe Georgie, if you two want to have a think about this. But how can educators and parents work together to address a child's behaviour and meet a child's needs?
That's a really good question. And where I've seen success between teachers and parents is when there's close communication. And particularly if a child's presenting with difficult behaviours, then actually connecting and meeting when things are going well, not just when things are going badly. So it's really important for the child to feel that there is a very strong connected relationship between the parents and the school, so that it doesn't feel like an adversarial relationship. And also that communication around particular micro moments that may be impacting the child's behaviour. So dropping the child off at school, if they've had a bad start to the day, then it's really important for the teacher to know that things aren't going well, and that then the teacher's expecting things, or they're about to address it early before those behaviours present in the classroom, and vice versa. You know, if they've not had a good day at school, and it can be said with love and kindness, but the sorts of things that the child may need at the end of the day for soothing. If it's been if the child's been overtaxed in processing and things like that. So I think really connecting around those micro moments. I think sometimes as either parents or teachers, we might not think they are so important, but they actually are.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, and I guess it's one that I can probably relate to more. Well, I can observe it from both sides, but I think that in my experience, and I have to say, you know, we have had fantastic experiences at different early learning centres with all of our girls, and we've sort of done a mixture of different things for them depending on what was working. But I have always found I think sometimes it's easy to forget how skilled, what a resource that the early educators and teachers are in sort of understanding challenges. So I know my husband and I have always been quite eager to talk through things that we're seeing at home, and getting their perspective is always very valuable. And I think, Joanne, your point about having those conversations probably in good and bad times is really worthwhile. I think that probably helps build the relationship to a point so that if there is something more challenging going on, you're starting from a point of sort of shared understanding. And I guess my advice in this scenario, where I think you can see successful or effective conversations, is where both the parent and the teacher really take a moment to appreciate where the other person is coming from. You know, I think as a parent, it's important that you recognise the conditions that, you know, that the teacher is working under, and that they don't just have one child, and it's not going to be possible necessarily for them to be on top of absolutely everything all of the time. And similarly, I think it's good when teachers can sort of appreciate that parents can be trying their absolute hardest and things can still go wrong. You know, I know for lots of parents, there's this incredible guilt when you get the phone call, or, you know, when you're pulled aside at pickup to be told about behavioural problems. A lot of parents will automatically internalise that as sort of, oh my goodness, I'm doing this all wrong. And that can often lead to, I think, quite a defensive stance oftentimes, because it's not easy. And I think it's probably like any conflict, or sort of in any workplace, in any marriage, it's kind of, I think, coming to it with that sort of shared understanding and taking a moment to appreciate their position, the other person's position, is probably quite useful.
Yes, thank you. There was some kind of comments there that really took me back to a time, and I love that idea of kind of building the relationship when things are going well, and noticing the good things as well. I had a Norwegian colleague that described for workers and parents to build relationships with school. He used this phrase of making friends in peacetime. And so kind of he meant reaching out to the school when things are going well. Don't wait for there to be a problem. And it really resonated with the group that he was trying to train and educate about the importance of building those collaborative relationships. Great, we've got a few questions coming in, so I'm just trying to juggle those between the phone, the chat, and my paper. So I've got one more question. This one's for Alison, and then I'll come into some of the ones that are coming through via the telephone. So Alison, children who have been abused sometimes struggle to attach to caregivers, and potentially in school settings as well. What can we do to improve this? What sort of things are proven to be effective in helping in that space?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. That's a great question, and often a really challenging situation that educators find themselves in, as well as carers. So we know that children grow into relationships. We're not born with an immediate, instantaneous attachment to our parents. We might have a fantasy about that, but we know that both parents and infants grow into the attachment, and we grow into that attachment through the thousands and thousands of interactions that occur across every day between the caregivers and the children, through the the interaction that we just saw between Georgie and Ruby, where Ruby approaches Georgie, Georgie's welcoming, she lifts her up, she gives her a cuddle. Those thousands of interactions. Ruby knows that when she approaches Georgie, she'll generally get a positive response. Sometimes she might not, but there'll be those thousands of interactions where parents have been predictable, relatively consistent. They've maybe repaired if there's been a rupture or something's gone wrong in the interaction, but they will have been consistent, predictable, empathetic, curious, and through that we develop attachments and a sense of safety. For children that haven't experienced that in a consistent way throughout their life, particularly from their primary caregivers, they're going to be suspicious and untrusting and maybe expect adults to be unpredictable and inconsistent and maybe sometimes punitive when they make an approach. So what that means for the carers that are involved with in the lives of those children, whether they be foster carers or educators, we need to take from that it will take thousands and thousands and then more thousands of interactions to build that trust for children and for that attachment to be able to develop. So it will require lots of patience on the side of the carers, which will need support. So absolutely picking up on what Georgie and Joanne have already said, it takes a community. We need to support parents and educators and everyone to work together to be consistent, to provide that predictability and that safe space for children. So the kind of the hard message is it's going to take time and thousands of interactions. The good news is you can keep trying and be kind to yourself if it doesn't happen overnight. But if we keep being consistent, predictable, reliable, empathetic, curious, you'll get there.
Thanks, Alice. I can see lots of nodding and smiles there. That was like very reaffirming of like our little interaction we had before we started. My daughter came in, now she's gone to bed happily. I wonder whether Tom or Joanne, whether you had any kind of thoughts in regard to that question from an education perspective?
So in schools, we would also support that notion of predictable routines too, and positive relationships and really nurturing those positive relationships. We, of course, at the Berry Street School use the Berry Street education model, and underpinning everything within that model is this idea of unconditional positive regard. So just ensuring that no matter what the child brings, no matter what behaviour they bring to the classroom, that actually they get to be accepted and brought into the community and not excluded. And that becomes an important way that a child can live out of shame or any kind of resentment of their behaviours and feel connected to the community because they're not being harshly judged because of that unconditional positive regard. So that and those predictable routines that Alison spoke of.
Thanks, Joanne. I love that phrase, unconditional positive regard. I think we talk about that with carers, with parents. You know, that's just such a great frame for us to have. So I've got a question that none of you would have had prep for. This is a fresh question. If a parent or carer was concerned that a child was showing signs of anxiety, what would we do about that, and what age would we start to want to do something about that? If we, you know, in early childhood or in other settings, we had some concerns around a child's anxious behaviours or anxious presentation.
You want me to go, Tom?
Yes, do you want to start off, Alice?
So it's never too early would be my first answer to that. Infants can be anxious. Young children can be anxious. We can all be anxious. The sooner that we can be provided with the support that we need to have a response to our feelings and to have them heard and listened to and responded to, the quicker our anxiety will reduce. So it's never too early. How we do that will depend on the age though. So the way in which we do that, but picking up on what Tom said before around helping children to make sense of their big feelings or their challenging feelings, and how they feel it in their body is very instructive as well. So helping children to think about, are they feeling that in their tummy, or are they feeling that in their head, or where are they feeling that, can give us a whole lot more information, as well as help the children to develop a language about the different feelings. Do they feel them as butterflies, or do they feel them as pain? And Tom can absolutely talk a bit more about that as well, I'm sure. I think if it's happening within a early learning centre, then I think it's a conversation to have with the parents around sharing the observations, again, you know, in a non-blaming, non-judgmental, non-shaming way. But you've made these observations and you're curious, and can we talk about it together? And if it's a parent observing this, then again, it's the similar conversation, maybe with the early childhood staff about, are they observing something similar in that environment? GP, maternal and child health, other health professionals, to together be curious and try to explore what might be going on for the child and what might need to be put in place to help the child feel more regulated and more calm.
Thank you, Alison. I don't know whether Tom or Joanne, you wanted to say anything else there, or we're ready for another question.
I'm just wanted to add, one of the reasons I love Berry Street is our real collaborative and care team approach to things. And so listening to Alison, who is one of our expert therapeutic and clinical leads, it's important for me to remember that I'm an educator. And so my role in a student or child's life is very specific, and it's up to me to work together with various other allied professionals and with families and carers and parents. And so this spirit of working together is something I've learned over the years at Berry Street, and I think something that we absolutely want to impart to the families that we're working with, particularly when we're concerned, as Alison said, earlier is better, when we notice signs and notice things that seem not quite right to that particular and unique child's routines, or that particular and unique child's habits through life. And so working together is always a goal for us.
Thanks, Tom. And I've got a couple of related questions now, one of which I already had in front of me and one of which has come through, which is a sort of follow-up question. So the first one is for you, Tom. Thinking of when, you know, children in school or in other settings kind of have meltdowns or tantrums, and what can we do to reduce the triggers for that? What things could you tell people, parents, carers, educators, that we can do to reduce those triggers?
Thank you. So I know our other panel friends will have a lot to say too. So I know it's hard when we're adults and we're facing a young person or a child melting down. But I want us to stay in our thinking brains as adults and remember that one of our most positive and powerful goals in this moment is to help soothe the central nervous system of not just the child in front of us, but our own, because we're mirroring that escalation, whether we wanted to or not, because we're human beings and we're constantly mirroring each other. I love that Alison introduced earlier the idea of nonverbal cues and sign language, and using sensory tools and toys and things that the child can begin to help soothe their own escalated selves, but also become cues to adults to say, this is when I need support. And when we are recovering from those trigger moments, we want you to say things like, I'm safe, you're safe, we're breathing together, I'm holding your hand, we're walking together. And when it comes to triggers and meltdowns, when children do come back online, when they are beginning to look like themselves again, and they begin to kind of look up and maybe begin to answer questions, those are moments of resilience and strength. And I love working with Joanne, and we use the word micro moments, and this idea that those micro moments of strength begin to peek out a little bit as the child comes back into themselves. And I want you to describe that to the child, because that's moments of strength. Say, you're breathing again. We can be curious about this together. We're gonna solve this together. And ultimately, I want the child and the adult to know, yes, I know the question was about triggers, but it's about conditions and noticing patterns and noticing what we can do to kind of see those micro moments before they occur. But I see both sides of this. There's things we can do on both sides. Joanne and Allison, I know you got something to say. No.
It's tricky when you're not in the room together. We're kind of looking, is Joanne jumping? Am I jumping? But anyway, I'll jump in. This is I'm an occupational therapist, and we think a lot about regulation, and this is an area that we think about a lot. The children that we work with, unfortunately, often have experienced abuse and neglect, predominantly in my program. And so they often haven't had experiences in their life necessarily where people have helped to build up their internal resources around how to manage big emotions. And so one of the pieces of work that we do with kids in absolutely the way that Tom's described is help to build up their own resource kit for how do they deal with big emotions, how do they help to manage those big emotions when they start to feel them, how can they recognize them in themselves. So developing that self-awareness, whether that be that they start to feel butterflies in their stomach, they start to see the color red, or however they feel those emotions, there's all of that pre-work that needs to happen in those quiet moments when things are calm, so that we can help to resource kids and those around them for how to respond and how to recognize the signs and signals. In the moment of a meltdown, as Tom's talked about, all of us, because sometimes adults have meltdowns as well, we've actually lost the ability to think in that moment. We are just in a survival mode, whether that be a flight or fight kind of survival mode. And unfortunately, as Georgie alluded to earlier, women, that's quite a familiar state of being for some women walking down the street at night. And it is hard to think in those moments. It is even more so for the kids we work with. So trying to get into a negotiation, trying to maybe wave a finger and try and correct behaviour in that moment will be a complete waste of airspace and won't give the child the support that they actually need. It is around being together and co-regulating through some of those things that Tom talked about, the walking together, the being close together, the support, maybe getting down on the same level, whether that's on the floor or wherever, to kind of be together with during this moment of large emotional distress. We need to have that empathy and that curiosity as to what's going on for the young person.
I just wanted to jump in to what Alison was saying around the connection between the body and doing pre-work. And just as a resource, there's some great YouTube clips around belly breathing. So even as young as like 3 and 4, you can ask them, and these are in the calm moments, and put a little teddy on their tummy and ask them to watch it breathe, watch it go up and down. And it's just this teachable moment around connecting their breathing and noticing their body and noticing what's happening in their body. I think there's even a lovely Sesame Street clip around, letting the monster out and then being able to put the monster back in through belly breathing. So that's a great resource that I know I've used a lot.
Thanks all. I'm going to go and look for that after this, for sure. That sounds like a great resource. I know we're getting towards the end. We've got a question here that I think will be good for our educators. You're obviously working with children, and Tom, you said you're in the school setting, you're in the education setting, so you're in one part of that young person's life. How do you support a child where there might be a lot of transitions going on for them outside of the school setting where you have no control over, and you can see the impact of that? What can you as educators do to provide something for that young person or that child in terms of support and managing that trauma and change and transition?
That's a big question, and we have 9 minutes left. So I'm just gonna give some breadcrumbs. Hopefully that helps. Transitions, none of us deal well with a lot of transition in our lives, and I think a lot about our young people at Berry Street and the incredible resilience they have to show to manage choices that they did not make, that were made for them. And so as an educator, the best educators I know are obsessed with routines and real predictable moments, not just in the week, but in the day, and to help kids predict those moments well, and for those moments to come good. And I know Joanne will want to jump in to talk about some of the great routines we have in our school. Just one more quick strategy is the notion of savoring. And we talk a lot about it at our Berry Street education programs, that we want to teach deliberate savoring, which is appreciation for the moment, the experience, the accomplishment. And young people that we serve don't quite understand there's so many great things they're doing every single day, because it's no big deal to them. They just keep moving on. And so we do so much to celebrate both the effort and accomplishment of our young people. And we want them to use that as a reservoir in times when they feel like the world is moving so fast and there's so many things they can't control. So to build up a bank of that skill. Joanne, do you want to add anything?
Definitely. Thank you, Tom. Echoing the predictable routines. And what we also ask our young people to do is actually develop focus plans. So how can they actually start to be their own advocate? And then in times of calm, that they actually get to say what makes them feel good and what helps them calm down. And so they can write those on, like that's for, I teach, our school is for secondary students. And so we identify what the child identifies what helps them calm when they start to feel themselves losing the ability to be ready to learn and to be in that space with others. Then a focus plan can actually just bring them back. And that may be listening to music. It may be having a walk side by side, or it could be the breathing, or it could be just being able to sit and read a book for a certain amount of time. But just the child having the skill, or we teach the child the skills to actually be their own advocate in those moments where there's beginning to unravel.
And we're doing exactly what Joanne so very specifically described in early childhood settings and centers as well, with pictures and making it visible to both remind and anchor the strategy for not just the child, but the staff, and then to celebrate when a child chooses one of those strategies to maintain and bring themselves back into their focus.
Thanks, both. You did pretty well. You've left us still a few minutes for another question, so hopefully that was helpful. I think we've got one last question. I think we could probably just squeeze in just a short answer from all four of our panelists, because it's a broader question. But how could we build more of a trauma-informed approach into our early childhood education settings? What one or two things could we do to build our trauma-informed thinking in those spaces?
I'm happy to jump in first and just reflect on a conversation that I had with a group of First Nations women who run a trauma-informed early learning program in Fitzroy Crossing. So Emily Carter runs the Behaviour service, and I found speaking to her incredibly powerful. And the way she explained it is quite simple, but you need to have people who are who understand and are across the issues that the children in that service are going to have. So if they know that virtually every child they have in that service will have experienced some level of trauma, and if you get people in, and that is a challenge, but if you can get early educators who are First Nations themselves, who are trained in delivering that trauma-informed care, the outcomes that you can expect are so much higher than it's sort of that thing of the children and the educators are not going to win if you pair people together that have no understanding of one another. And I know that's probably very simplistic, but I just think that at a really basic level, there needs to be some understanding and skill and support for the educators who are delivering that trauma-informed learning. That is, in my view, probably a very layperson's view of how you can have that layer there as it's needed.
Georgie, I think sometimes simple is on point. And what I was going to say was a trauma-informed approach is curious, which is not dissimilar to what you've said. Curious about why. Why is a child looking, behaving, being in a particular way? And what's happened that's contributed to that? What's going on in the background? What's the backstory that's contributing to that? So curiosity, which is essentially what you said as well.
I just want to thank Georgie for joining us tonight, and to thank you, Georgie. I love what you said at the end of your talk. Systemic problems require systemic solutions. And so this is what we're doing. We're a system, we're working together. We're coming from so many different parts of our community to advocate together. And there are so many people here tonight who are on the ground doing the work every day. And there are people who are supporting us, and that's what it takes, and we're doing it.
Thank you, Tom. We're coming towards our end, so I'm going to say thank you to everybody that's been part of our panel, and especially to Georgie, who kicked us off and brought in a child to really bring us, to focus. The discussion really got going there, and I think probably we've got enough questions to have kept talking for another little while, but we are approaching 8 o'clock, so I'm going to say thanks to Georgie, Tom, Alison, and Joanne, and everybody that's participated and asked questions, put stuff in the chat. There's a whole lot of resources there. This has been recorded, so if you want to watch it again, or you want to share it with colleagues, or there'll be information about how to do that. Also in the chat, there's some telephone numbers. Some of the themes we talked about can be difficult, so numbers are in front of you now if you want to reach out, and we would encourage you to do so. And lastly, just to say to please join the Thrive by 5 campaign and stay informed for any future events, and enjoy the rest of your evening. It's almost Friday, and enjoy the weekend ahead.